the lake that disappears without a trace. A story that was never recorded every year, the lake appears without warning, reflects the sky for a few nights, and disappears as if it had never existed. People who approach swear that the water remembers them. This story begins the moment the shore began to breathe, and someone realized that the reflection no longer copied reality, but replaced it, and observed. In silence, the lake doesn't just disappear, it takes something with it. Official records have been erased, old maps torn up, and residents pretend not to remember the days when the water reflected faces that weren't there. There's a hidden detail, an event that was never recorded because those who witnessed it could never explain what they saw without feeling that something, on the other side of the surface, was still listening, waiting for the exact moment to be remembered again. And when the truth emerges, it will become clear that the lake doesn't disappear to hide. It observes, always. The case began as an ignored rumor, repeated only among longtime residents who swore they saw a lake appear where there had once been dry land. At first, no one took it seriously, until weather records began to show flaws and photographs revealed impossible reflections. The absence of official explanations transformed curiosity into unease, and it soon became clear that it was not a collective illusion, but something that defied memory, maps, and the very notion of permanence. When the first people tried to locate the exact spot days later, they found only cracked ground and an uncomfortable silence, too heavy to be natural, as if the place had forgotten to exist. The place where the lake appeared was set back from the main road, surrounded by low vegetation and ancient trees that seemed to grow in awkward positions, leaning inwards, as if observing the empty center. The air there was always colder, even under strong sun, and the wind had a metallic smell that was difficult to explain. When the lake appeared, the surrounding ground darkened, becoming too damp in a few minutes, while insects disappeared and birds avoided flying over the area. At night, the surface of the water reflected no stars, only a smooth, deep darkness, creating the sensation that the sky had been replaced by something that did not belong to this world. The first sign that something was wrong didn't come from the lake itself, but from the people. One man returned from the shore saying he had only lost a few minutes, although his watch showed hours more. Another swore he heard footsteps behind him, even though he was alone. Small lapses in memory became frequent, names forgotten, routes confused, identical dreams described by strangers. When a child drew the lake even before it appeared that year, the residents felt a collective unease difficult to name. It wasn't fear yet, but the unsettling certainty that the place was announcing itself, preparing something. The lake didn't appear randomly. It responded to something invisible, as if testing who was attentive enough to perceive that reality was beginning to give way. The main witness was a woman who had lived near the site since childhood and claimed to remember all the lake's appearances. She described the water as too still, without ripples, even when touched. According to her, when she leaned over to observe her own reflection, she saw something lagging behind, copying her movements with a slight interval, as if making a conscious decision. The woman said she heard her name coming from the surface, not as a sound, but as an imposed thought. As she moved away, she felt immediate relief, followed by guilt, as if she had abandoned someone. In the following days, she began to dream of the dry lake, hearing footsteps coming from beneath the earth, always stopping exactly where she woke up, sweating profusely and with the feeling of still being watched. The investigation began discreetly, conducted by local authorities who treated the case as an unusual environmental phenomenon. Technicians collected soil samples, installed sensors, and recorded aerial images, but the data always showed flaws after the lake disappeared. Corrupted recordings, empty files, notes that seemed to have been altered after being written. One report mentioned circular marks on the ground, too deep for simple erosion, but this section was removed from the final version. As the investigation progressed, those involved began to report extreme fatigue, difficulty concentrating, and the strange feeling of having been there before, as if the process itself was being repeated against their will, guided by something that refused to be documented. The object was found partially buried near the center where the lake used to appear, revealed only when the ground gave way after a light rain. It didn't look like stone or metal, but something in between, too smooth and cold to the touch. There were no manufacturing marks, only curved lines that changed depending on the angle of view. When it was removed, the surrounding environment became strangely silent, as if the sound had been muffled. Those who held it reported pressure on their head and the sensation of holding something that shouldn't exist outside of water. Photographs of the object disappeared, and descriptions varied among observers, as if it refused to take on a definitive form. The most unsettling thing was the shared certainty that the object hadn't been found, but left there, waiting to be touched. If this interpretation is making you rethink this story, leave a comment below with your perspective. These videos are meant to provoke reflection, and I read all the comments. And if this type of content interests you, subscribe to the channel so you don't miss the next ones. After the object was removed, the lake did not return that year. What followed was an abnormal, heavy silence that spread through the village like an invisible fog. Conversations ceased. Radios crackled without a signal. Domestic animals lay motionless, staring at the empty land for long periods. People woke up at night with the impression that something had been interrupted in the middle of an essential process. It wasn't tranquility, but suspension, as if the world were holding its breath. Some residents claimed to hear water moving beneath the ground, a slow, deep flow, synchronized with their own heartbeats. The silence did not signify the end of the phenomenon, but a calculated pause, an uncomfortable interval that suggested the lake had receded only to reorganize something larger, invisible, and inevitable. The turning point came when old personal records began to surface, forgotten diaries and tapes that contradicted everything that had been believed until then. The lake didn't appear every year, only when certain people were present in the village. Dates coincided with returns, births, specific visits. It wasn't the location that attracted the phenomenon, but individuals linked by something impossible to trace. The mysterious object began to be seen in dreams by different residents, always at the bottom of dark water. It was then realized that the investigation was never external. The lake wasn't being studied. It was conducting a silent experiment, observing human reactions to the possibility of being reflected by something that knew their intentions, even before they were formed. Collective fear spread rapidly when everyone understood that no one was beyond the lake's reach. Improvised meetings ended in silent accusations, lingering stares, and doors locked early. People avoided mirrors, running water, and polished surfaces. Children cried for no reason, saying they could see the lake behind their closed eyes. The panic wasn't explosive, but dense, constant, corroding routine. Some tried to leave but returned hours later, confused, unable to explain their way. The common feeling was of being counted, catalogued, as if each reaction fed something patient beneath the earth. The forbidden theory was never officially written down, only whispered among those who had cross-referenced too much data to ignore patterns. The lake was neither a natural phenomenon nor an isolated anomaly, but an observation mechanism. It appeared to measure reactions, record choices, test emotional limits. The water did not reflect people, but discarded possibilities, versions that were not lived. The object found would be a marker, an anchor point between layers of reality. That is why it needed to be returned to the earth. The most disturbing idea was simple and intolerable. The lake did not appear to study humans, but to decide which consciousnesses deserved to continue existing outside of it. The search ended without an official announcement, as if it had never happened. Equipment was collected, documents disappeared, and veiled orders instructed everyone to abandon the area. The lake didn't return, but the feeling of closure was false. Some residents began to socially disappear, still physically present but empty, repeating emotionless routines. The main witness stopped talking, limiting themselves to observing the ground as if listening to something distant. The object was never found again, and no one remembered exactly where it had been kept. The forced consensus was that persisting would mean crossing an invisible boundary. There were no more questions, only the unsettling acceptance that certain searches don't end because they are resolved, but because they are interrupted before anything answers back. The revelation didn't happen suddenly. but slowly seeped into the collective consciousness. The lake no longer needed to appear because it had learned enough. The marked people now carried the reflection within themselves, repeating thoughts that weren't entirely their own. Dreams began to coincide with future decisions, as if choices had already been observed before being made. The witness, in their last account, stated that they finally understood the delay in the reflection. It wasn't a glitch. It was editing. The lake showed who someone would become after crossing certain boundaries. Upon disappearing, it left behind adjusted, tested, silently approved, or discarded human versions. The most disturbing thing wasn't its absence, but the certainty that the selection had already occurred, and no one knew exactly on which side of the surface they had woken up. The lake's legacy wasn't recorded in books or reports, but in the way the village came to exist. No one fully trusted their own memories anymore, and simple decisions were made with excessive caution, as if every choice could be observed by something invisible. The land where the lake emerged remained untouched, avoided without explanation. Children born later described dreams of dark water, even without ever having seen the active site. The true legacy wasn't the disappearance, but the silent shift in the perception of reality. The lake taught without words that not everything one observes needs to remain visible. Some things disappear simply because they have fulfilled their purpose.